What does the latest interview with WayForward's James Montana signify for the future of Advance Wars, or indeed other titles from the California-based Nintendo collaborator? Is Advance Wars a series with a future, or a textbook example of how franchise revivals can go badly wrong? Let's investigate. One of the underrated gems of the last few years, Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp has had, to say the least, a troubling history. Originally slated for late 2021, it was pushed into 2022, and then, because of global circumstances, Nintendo made the decision to delay it indefinitely. The choice was sensible in some ways, given the sensibilities of the time, but it also associated the game with real-world conflicts in a way that was problematic, and it meant there was never really going to be a good time to drop it. The time they chose was almost deliberately as inauspicious as possible, in April 2023, a few weeks after Metroid Prime Remastered, but a few weeks before Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and Pikmin 4. In an absolutely hype bomb period, it was really eminently overlookable, and indeed was overlooked. There are also some signs that production was not entirely smooth sailing. A tester who worked with WayForward anonymously spoke to YouTuber Mangs and reported quite a few concerns from issues we have heard separately about people with red badges feeling like second-class citizens to slow response times from Nintendo and WayForward when many crashes and issues were reported. This surely accounts for the delay out of 2021. Look, testing is a necessary part of the video game process, something Nintendo usually focuses on hugely to make sure that even if they do occasionally put out games which feel a little content thin, they almost never feel buggy, and indeed, they issued an apology for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet having so many issues when that game launched. However, extra testing does add to cost on what presumably was a very low-budget title for Nintendo. The tester, known only as Anvil, also offers his view about how well the game sold. I think it's clear that Anvil has some bitterness, and the fact that he is anonymously speaking on an internet forum in breach of his non-disclosure agreement suggests that there may be some level of resentment or disillusionment motivating his decision, but nevertheless, his assessment may also hold some value. He says that he was let go a year early and so did not hear how it sold, but he said, and I quote, "I do know there is general disapproval of the game's overall performance, but considering the franchise's history and the curse it holds, a part of me feels they don't care." Okay, so general disapproval is really so vague that it's difficult to quantify, and I don't know that Nintendo in Japan would see any kind of curse attached to Advance Wars. I certainly hope not anyway, although I imagine he's referring to the fact that one of the previous Advance Wars games released in September 2001. Realistically though, Nintendo will be well aware that circumstances meant that Advance Wars never had a fair crack at benefiting from the Switch effect this time out. He does also point out the game was released very late in Japan and was not even given physical copies, which only complicates the unit calculations. To quote a Reddit post, "They sent this game out to die." They released the game 2 weeks before Tears of the Kingdom was set to come out. With the lack of advertising and the constant delays, lack of communication with the players, and the ongoing conflict, it was destined to fail. All of that is true, however, what I will say is that the Japanese digital-only release is interesting. Not all franchises appeal equally to all parts of the world. Pikmin is, proportionate to its size at least, far bigger in Japan compared to the West. Metroid and even Zelda have a far bigger ratio of their audience in the West than in Japan, and Advance Wars definitely falls into the latter category. Bypassing a physical release is surely a sign of a huge lack of confidence in the title, but it also means that Nintendo gets to maximize profitability as online sales are more valuable to Nintendo. In this sense, acknowledging that Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp had already been hobbled out of the gate, particularly in Japan, it kind of makes sense for them to say, let's not throw good money after bad with a physical release, but try to maximise the profits on the units we do sell. Frankly, I kind of wish they'd bypass the physical copies at all. One of the reasons I suspect Famicom Detective Club was so quickly brought back was the fact that it was being sold digitally, and so even if its overall sales were low, probably not that low given the popularity of visual novels and adventure games in Japan, but still relatively low, the actual profit per unit would have been rather high, especially since both the remakes and the Emio the Smiling Man follow-up had rather high price points to start with. The same would not have been true of Advance Wars, although perhaps the higher sales in America at least would make it look slightly stronger on the Japanese balance sheets due to the weak yen. Moreover, reception from dedicated Advance Wars fans was mixed for all sorts of reasons. One refrain echoed by this tester is that the game appears childish. As Anvil says, the overall aesthetic does not match the story, the theme, or the reality that, hello, this is a game about war. Why are you making your war game look so plastic? And here, I completely disagree, and I think Nintendo were absolutely right to lean into the toy soldier aesthetic. You see, Nintendo is all about tapping into different ways to play. Yoshiaki Koizuma's advice to aspiring developers was to think about play more broadly than just video games, and I think with Advance Wars, it kind of bypasses traditional games and takes us back to toy soldiers on the move, a game that has probably existed for as long as humans have had games of any sort. Obviously, there is a lot of strategic complexity heaped on top of that, but that was always the idea. Now, Advance Wars can actually be a pretty challenging title, and also, as is to be expected of any narrative based in ideas of war, has some tough themes. Therefore, arguably, the more child-friendly mechanics don't suit its gameplay and its story, but this is still a Nintendo title and it needs to fit their oeuvre. Can Nintendo go for a darker, more bleak aesthetic and be successful, at least on a creative level? Self-evidently yes, as anybody who has played Emio the Smiling Man through to the end can attest. But just because you can, doesn't mean you should. And of course with Days of Ruin, Nintendo did experiment with a bleaker aesthetic for Advance Wars in the past. Then again, frankly, the narrative of Advance Wars, wherein people gleefully and cheerily enter mass casualty conflicts, doesn't really work on the level of gritty realism. It only works if you view it as a kind of game, and the best way to represent that is through an aesthetic of toy soldiers, a game that's been played by children and adults alike for millennia. And once you follow the logic of that through, you realise that this is not some kind of grim and gritty franchise, and frankly, nor should it be. It's an entertaining tactical experience with a bright story mode and some mascot characters, not some meditation on the harrowing evil of conflict in the world. And here I would draw the comparison with chess. Chess is a simulation of conflict with pieces that are often literally plastic, and that helps because it de-emphasises the war theming. The fact is forgotten that the game is having you kill bishops, kings and pawns, an Anglo-Norman word by the way for foot soldier, not synonymous with a manipulable and disposable person. These pawns were basically innocent people dragooned in to fight. Indeed, you can focus on the tactics and the actual game of chess divorced from the original concept of it as a simulation for military conflict. There is definitely a level of disconnect if you think about Advance Wars too much on a narrative level, but fundamentally, where it excels is in the gameplay. Now, there are other criticisms such as the multiplayer mode, and some people have found glitches. I'm not massively plugged into the hardcore Advance Wars community, and while I've seen some really intelligent deconstruction of the game, I've also seen people complaining about the fact that it's called Reboot, but isn't a reboot, seemingly overlooking the military pun. Clearly, there is a segment of that audience for whom Reboot Camp was, at best, somewhat disappointing. However, it won't surprise long-term viewers of this channel to know I do think this is an excellent package which I wholeheartedly recommend to any Nintendo fans. With 2 games in it, both superb in their own right, plus level editors and multiplayer options, it's a very rich experience. That's not to dismiss complaints, but I do feel that what we have here is a gift horse and mouth situation. There were years of my life where for various reasons I played fewer video games except for a handful of favourites, and one of those would always be Advance Wars, which I would return to fairly regularly. Seeing any kind of renaissance for the property is a joy, and the idea that people are sleeping on this one because of any kind of perceived flaws really strikes me as letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Perhaps the biggest controversy here is the toy soldier aesthetic replacing that classic pixel art, but to me it was a very sensible step, as well as looking quite attractive in an idiosyncratic way. Of course, we don't know for sure how well or how poorly Advance Wars actually did. There are rumours that seem to be viewed very sceptically of it achieving 400,000 sales in its first few weeks, and it topped the eShop charts for a while. However, it didn't reach the threshold of 1 million sales, which would have led it to it being reported to investors, and of course there are other costs such as refunding the advanced sales after the initial delay, which would need to be factored in. Still, there are reasons to be cheerful. A recent interview with James Montana, the game's director, on the Fragments of Silicon podcast revealed some quite interesting tidbits, including how WayForward had courted Nintendo with proposals on a number of occasions with entertaining pitches, but that it was, as he accounts for it, Nintendo who approached them with the proposal of remaking Advance Wars. This is something that I'm really pleased to hear as a massive fan of Advance Wars, because I suspect that one of the key drivers of whether a game series continues to get its shot or drops out of consideration is very simply the presence or not of a champion at Nintendo, or at least someone with an interest in the series. In this case, the likeliest person seems to be senior producers with Nintendo's EPD external group in Japan, Toyokazu Nonaka, and the Nintendo of America-based Takao Nakano, who has produced or supported development of several games that were developed with the heavy involvement outside of Japan. Neither seem to be heavily involved on the creative end, but we'll take what we can get. Of course, Montana has definitely not been working on a sequel, as he has a different title in the works for Atari. This is disappointing because traditionally Nintendo's remakes to new title pipeline has always been pretty smooth. Mercury Steam went straight from Metroid Samus Returns to Metroid Dread. Mages went from the Famicom Detective Club remakes to Emio the Smiling Man. Of course, both these studios were capable of multiple titles at once, but the specific teams that worked on the Nintendo games seem to have carried straight over. And although their history with Zelda is a bit more complicated than just the 2-game dataset I'm using here, you could also point to Grezzo, doing both Link's Awakening and then following right up with Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. Now, WayForward is a diversified company, but it would be surprising for the same director not to stay on board for the sequel game. Having said that, it shouldn't be a surprise that they moved on from Advance Wars. The game was by all accounts finished by the start of 2022, so WayForward were never going to sit in their hands for an unknowable period, which turned out to be 16 months before the game released, and Nintendo were never going to greenlight a sequel on a series where they had an as-yet unreleased game in the bag. This doesn't preclude Nintendo and WayForward working together at a future point, it just means that the time was not ripe at that particular juncture. The advantages of this kind of arrangement that we saw with Mages, Mercury Steam and Grezzo is that Nintendo gets to use a remake to reacquaint everybody on the project with an older franchise and ensure everyone is philosophically on the same page, and then they get to move forward to an original project. The great advantage of this strategy is that the first title has costs for building game mechanics and assets, but doesn't have the same costs associated with creating story and creating strong and original gameplay content, while the sequel has the costs associated with developing new material, but can recycle assets and leverage the experience of the development staff. It's a smart move creatively and financially, and I would expect to see this continue. Nintendo may well feel like Advance Wars, which seems like an obvious candidate for this kind of renewal, especially since they themselves initiated the so-called reboot, is unfinished business. Still, assuming a 3-year development window, and since Montana's new game is releasing in 2024, we will be talking about 2027 before a new Advance Wars could potentially release, and even then, the original was designed for Switch hardware, not anything more advanced. Being one of the last first-party games on a dying system hasn't always worked out well. Strictly speaking, Alpha Dream's Mario & Luigi Bowser's Fury remake wasn't the last 3DS first-party game, but it did incredibly poorly for a Mario title and seemed to help push the development team off the perch. The fact that added costs would be required to make this work for a sequel system makes me skeptical that it will come. Plus, Nintendo will be aware of the fallacy of sunk costs. Yes, they put a lot into developing Advance Wars, but that doesn't mean it paid off for them. And while rolling a development team straight from a remake title to a sequel, as they did with Mages and Mercury Steam, capitalizes on momentum, that momentum is now clearly dissipated. There is also the logistical issue of how Nintendo feels about releasing a war-themed title. For sure, I can't imagine any Advance Wars game ever again getting a long hype cycle, because twice now, in September 2001 and April 2023, Advance Wars has ended up scheduled by complete accident against painful real-world events. This has disadvantages for a title that is already niche, as it prevents a long build-up and promotion, but then again, compressing the hype cycle into a short window may be beneficial in terms of maximising bang for the promotional buck. So, specifically for Advance Wars, what is the prognosis? For all the flack Nintendo gets for sitting on franchises, and as sympathetic as I am to fans of Star Tropics, Custom Robo, Mother, Eternal Darkness, and Mole Mania, the fact is that by and large Nintendo does have a habit of trying its franchises again and again and again, so the overall likelihood of another Advance Wars title remains high, especially if the system it releases on continues to experience relative success. Then again, the lack of a singular creative force at Nintendo really championing it, the difficulty of scheduling the game, and perhaps once again the lack of a dedicated team of collaborators to push it, is likely to put Advance Wars to the back of the queue in terms of development priorities. The fact that the original games were developed by Intelligent Systems, who do have a financial motive in making sure that there are regular releases of their series, does put it slightly higher, but it's not clear that Intelligent Systems were heavily involved in this remake at all, and they've been pretty busy with Fire Emblem, WarioWare, Paper Mario, and that's before we even consider that they may have their own original titles or titles like Pushmo coming back as well in the future. At this point, I think we're looking at only a 50% chance of seeing another title in this series before the end of the decade. For other franchises gearing up for revival though, I think Advance Wars' apparent failure might be overstated. If you look down the list of where these collaborations with partners on remakes have borne fruit in terms of original games, Grezzo, Mages, Mercury Steam, and arguably even Eighting, who took a far bigger role in Pikmin 4, these partnerships prove successful far more often than not, and Nintendo, by WayForward's own admission, are incredibly choosy and cautious about building and developing these relationships. They took their time, they chose wisely, they crafted an aesthetic for the new title which, I would argue, is right for the franchise, even if it alienated a proportion of the most dedicated fan base, who, let's face it, were mostly going to buy the game anyway. And even the title's original scheduling slot was not prime selling territory. Mid-December, after the Black Friday sales, is not a spot for a title that is going to give Mario Kart 8 a run for its money. They knew it was a niche title, and I'm sure they budgeted and planned accordingly. They did things right, and yet circumstances scuppered them. I don't think this harms Nintendo's underlying philosophy of how to approach remakes, and I don't even think it harms their underlying philosophy of how to approach Advance Wars, beyond being exceptionally cautious about their announcement to scheduling window in future. Personally, as a fan of a number of niche Nintendo franchises, I am really optimistic that we will continue to see not just Advance Wars, Pikmin, 2D Zelda and 2D Metroid, but other franchises being adopted by passionate collaborators outside Nintendo. Star Fox, F-Zero, Wave Race, Donkey Kong Country, and many more all stand out as having huge potential, and as Nintendo is growing its internal teams, I think there's a lot more potential for these franchises to eventually find their feet either internally or using collaborations. I just really hope that Advance Wars continues in that lineup somewhere. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you as ever to my Patreon supporters. Please check out these videos if you're interested in more, and otherwise I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.